Dear Army, before we dive in, I have a small request. As you may know, I haven't been able to post for the past 2 weeks due to our house move, and my insights have really dropped. If you could please leave a like and make 3 to 4 comments, we could reach around 40 to 50 interactions to help revive my insights. Let's keep a target of reaching 69 comments within 24 hours. Thank you so much, and as always, I purple you. Purple heart. After Taehyung's successful intervention with Mr. Lee's health scare, Grandpa Lee insisted that Y/N show Taehyung around as a gesture of gratitude. Y/N, reluctantly agreeing to this forced outing, rolled her eyes, knowing her grandpa's real intention, to give them some time alone together. So here they were, in one of Taegu's finest restaurants. The dim lighting cast a warm glow across the room, accentuating the elegant decor. Taehyung, genuinely intrigued, looked around before his gaze settled on Y/N. So, Y/N began, stirring her drink. You're a cardiologist. Isn't that a bit intense? Taehyung gave a small smile. It has its moments, but I love my work. Helping people, saving lives, it's fulfilling. Although. He trailed off, glancing at her, it's been pretty consuming so far. Consuming, huh? She said, raising a brow, her tone challenging. So you're saying you'd have no time left for family, right? I mean, between emergencies and all-nighters at the hospital, family dinners and vacations must be out of the question. Not necessarily, he replied, looking amused by her barrage of questions. I'd prioritize my family. Just because I'm a doctor doesn't mean I can't balance my time. I'd make an effort for the right person. He looked at her meaningfully. Y/N let out a small, skeptical laugh. The right person, huh? And you think a doctor can actually make that work? She tilted her head, feigning disinterest, though her eyes glimmered with a hint of amusement. Absolutely. In fact, I'm willing to prove it to you, he said, leaning forward. If you'd let me, that is. Y/N looked away, hiding her smirk. Her grandfather's plan was going better than she wanted to admit. Well, Dr. Kim, she teased, let's see if you really know how to balance that lifestyle of yours. All the while, Taehyung was oblivious to the truth that the ugly fiancé he came to reject was sitting right across from him. The next morning, as Taehyung and Y/N sat across from each other at the breakfast table, the light streaming through the windows highlighted Taehyung's amused gaze fixed on Y/N. He leaned in, a subtle grin on his lips. Did I mention that breakfast looks even better when shared with someone as stunning as you? Y/N rolled her eyes, though a hint of color rose to her cheeks. Is that your best line, Dr. Kim? Maybe you should save the flattery for your patients. He laughed, enjoying her reaction. Why would I waste my charm on anyone but you? She took a bite of her toast, maintaining her composed demeanor. Because, Dr. Kim, I'm not as easily impressed as your patients. Challenge accepted, he replied with a playful glint, leaning back with satisfaction as she tried to hide her smirk. As they wandered through the mansion's lush garden later that day, Taehyung slowed his pace, letting their shoulders brush occasionally as he admired the blooming flowers. He glanced at her, his gaze warm. You know, Y/N, I could get used to moments like these. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. Moments like, what? Walking in the garden? He chuckled. Walking with you. Although I doubt you'd admit you enjoy my company. Y/N scoffed, crossing her arms. Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm just doing this to be polite. Taehyung stopped, stepping into her path, making her halt. Polite, huh? Then why did you blush at breakfast? His voice was teasing, his eyes never leaving hers. Y/N huffed, brushing past him. You're imagining things, Dr. Kim. I don't blush. His laugh followed her as she quickened her pace, her cheeks a telltale pink. That evening, Y/N had settled into the library, her favorite refuge in the mansion, and was absorbed in a novel when she heard a familiar voice. Still ignoring me, I see, Taehyung's voice was a low murmur from the doorway. He strolled in, his gaze lingering on her as he moved closer. Without looking up, Y/N replied, I'm not ignoring you, Dr. Kim. I just happen to have more interesting things to do. He leaned over her shoulder, his cologne filling her senses. More interesting than me? I'm hurt. Finally, she looked up, a smirk tugging at her lips. Yes, well, I find books reliable. Unlike certain people who think they're irresistible. Taehyung chuckled, taking a seat beside her. And here I thought you'd enjoy a little challenge. I may just have to change your mind, Y/N. Y/N met his gaze, her voice soft but firm. I wouldn't count on it, Dr. Kim. But as they held each other's gaze, both felt the silent spark between them, and neither seemed willing to look away. Y/N lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling as her mind drifted to Taehyung. Despite her initial determination to avoid marrying him, she couldn't help but think about his qualities. He was undeniably handsome, charming, and dedicated to his work. Unlike her assumptions about doctors being dull, he had a playful, flirty side that added to his appeal. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as bad as she thought. As she pondered, she found herself smiling slightly, wondering if her aversion to him might have been too quick. Is he really that bad? She mused, her mind replaying moments of their banter and his gentle smiles. Meanwhile, Taehyung sat by his window, gazing into the dark sky, his thoughts filled with Y/N. He smiled to himself as he recalled her retorts, her fiery nature, and how she always seemed to have a comeback for his teasing. She was nothing like the women he had known before, her personality was bold, challenging, and strangely refreshing. For the first time, he found himself genuinely interested in someone's spirit as well as their looks. He couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to marry her, sharing these small moments and bickering with her for a lifetime. A warmth spread in his chest at the thought. But then, his mind wandered to his actual fiancée, the one his grandparents had chosen. He shuddered, recalling the nightmare of her picture, quickly dismissing the thought. If only I could marry someone like Y/N instead of that woman, he thought wistfully, completely unaware that they were, in fact, the same person. As he drifted off to sleep, a strange sense of anticipation filled him, leaving him wondering what the future held with this fascinating woman. Taehyung descended the stairs, feeling refreshed and ready to start the day. As he reached the bottom, he noticed a familiar figure seated on the couch in the living room. Taehyung, smiling, hey. The woman turned around, her eyes lighting up. Mrs. Kang, Omo. Dr. Kim. Taehyung chuckled, recognizing her immediately. Taehyung, Mrs. Kang. You seem healthy. Mrs. Kang, yes, thanks to you, Dr. Kim. I'm living a normal life again. Taehyung, nodding, I'm glad. You're here for. Mrs. Kang, oh. I came to meet Mr. Lee Min-soo. Taehyung frowned slightly, the name sounding off. Taehyung, you mean. Lee Min-sook? Mrs. Kang looked puzzled. Mrs. Kang, no. Mr. Lee Min-soo. A sense of confusion began to settle over Taehyung. Taehyung, he lives here. Mrs. Kang, yes. Why? Who are you here with? Taehyung scratched his head, trying to process the conversation. Taehyung, I came with Mr. Lee Min-sook? Mrs. Kang blinked, then laughed lightly. Mrs. Kang, Min-sook? Who's that? That's Mr. Lee Min-soo on the wall. She pointed to a portrait on the wall, showing a dignified man and a young girl in a blue dress. Taehyung's face fell. Taehyung, internally this can't be, Mrs. Kang chuckled, oblivious to Taehyung's internal turmoil. Mrs. Kang, only one Lee Min-soo is this wealthy around here. You must have misheard a Min-sook. Just then, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both Taehyung and Mrs. Kang turned to see Y/N entering the room. Mrs. Kang, Omo, Y/N. You're getting prettier every day. Y/N smiled politely, her gaze flickering to Taehyung before turning back to Mrs. Kang. Mrs. Kang, when are you getting married, dear? Before Y/N could answer, Mrs. Kang leaned closer, her eyes twinkling. Mrs. Kang, isn't your fiancé here yet? I heard he's a doctor in Seoul. Maybe Dr. Kim knows him. Y/N's eyes widened, a hint of nervousness flashing across her face. Y/N, I. Mrs. Kong glanced between them, as if realizing something, while Taehyung's mind spun with the revelation. Mrs. Kong noticed the sudden silence, her brows furrowing with curiosity. Mrs. Kong, concerned at what happened. Did your fiancé break the engagement, dear? Y/N's lips parted, caught off guard, but before she could respond, Taehyung cut in. Taehyung, forcing a smile. No, he didn't. Actually, I'm her fiancé. Mrs. Kong gasped, her face lighting up in surprise and delight. Mrs. Kong, oh my. That's wonderful news. Y/N glanced away, avoiding Taehyung's gaze, while he stood frozen, his face an unreadable mix of emotions as the weight of the revelation settled in. Mrs. Kang's eyes sparkled as she processed the surprising news, placing a hand over her mouth in delight. She leaned forward, her excitement evident. Mrs. Kong, gushing, this is wonderful. I never imagined I'd meet both of you together like this. Fate works in mysterious ways. Taehyung forced a smile, his heart racing as he replayed every interaction he'd had with Y/N. The girl he'd come to reject, thinking she was unattractive and uninteresting, was none other than the charming woman he'd been drawn to. Y/N, however, avoided his gaze, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and discomfort. She could feel his stare, filled with a mix of confusion and realization, piercing through her. Her fingers fidgeted nervously as she tried to keep her composure. Mrs. Kong continued, oblivious to the tension. Mrs. Kong. Y/N, you didn't tell me he was such a handsome doctor. What a perfect match, beauty and brains on both sides. Taehyung clenched his jaw, grappling with the reality. Everything he'd said, all his previous judgments, now seemed foolish. His thoughts were racing, how could I have been so wrong? In the tense atmosphere of the Lee family living room, Taehyung faced Mr. Lee Min-soo, eyes filled with disappointment. You lied to me. You pretended to be someone else, completely deceived me. I trusted your word. Mr. Lee sighed, his face somber. I understand your frustration, Taehyung, but I had my reasons. I was shocked when I found out you were the son of my best friend, Kim Suho. Suho and I had dreamed of this marriage. Breaking this engagement would have crushed his spirit. I wanted to honor his wish, and to do that, I needed to understand your motives. His gaze drifted to YN. The reason behind your decision was clear when I looked at her. Taehyung turned toward YN, his face a mixture of frustration and curiosity. And you? Why go through all this trouble? Who even was that girl in the picture you sent me? Read more. YN swallowed, looking away. Just some picture I found online. I didn't want to marry you, okay? And why not? Taehyung's voice was both incredulous and demanding. What's so wrong with marrying me? With a defiant gaze, YN replied, because I don't want to be a doctor's wife. I watched my mom go through it, how dad was always gone, always putting his patients first. She was left alone, and I was left alone. I don't want that life for myself, and I don't want it for my kids. Mr. Lee's face showed a mix of shock and sorrow. YN, your father was the best surgeon in town. He was helping people, saving lives. YN shook her head, her voice unwavering. And I needed him too. We needed him, Granddad. If you want me to marry Taehyung, then he has to leave his career and join our family business. Otherwise, I'm not doing it. Both Mr. Lee and Taehyung were stunned into silence, caught off guard by her firm ultimatum.